Hi, I'm Susan Dixon. I'm the current president of the Chinese Historical Society of Southern California. I want to welcome everybody tonight. Thank you for attending. We have been having monthly meetings since 1976. We had to go online starting September. So here we are starting out the new year with an exciting program. We disable the chat function, but during the program, you can type any questions you might have in the question and answer. This program will be recorded. To introduce our speaker, I chose a longtime friend of his, Cindy Fong. She is our current membership secretary. And so Cindy, take it away.
Thank you, Susan. It is a distinct delight to introduce Victor Ju. He is a product of Los Angeles Chinatown, Los Angeles Public School System, and UCLA, who has held a long-time affinity for Asian American studies. Victor received his Ph.D. from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and has devoted his career to disseminating with sensitivity and knowledge myriad topics of Asian American history and culture. Currently teaching at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, Dr. Ju has offered courses such as Intro to Asian American Studies, Asian Food Worlds, and Asian Hollywood Fads and Fears. He has published in Los Angeles Chinese American history, specifically the Anti-Chinese Massacre of 1871 and its strange career, an essay in a companion to the Los Angeles, edited by William Deverell of USC. He has also included a new introduction of the 1871 massacre that appeared as the Anti-Chinese Massacre in Los Angeles as a Reconstruction-era event, which was included in the Oxford Encyclopedia of American Urban Study, edited by Timothy Gilfoyle. Tonight, Victor gifts us with insight on the history of Chinese America and the U.S. Midwest, ranging from 1870 to the present. Let's enjoy an evening of thoughtful and careful scholarship and introspection. Thank you, Victor.
Thank you, Cindy. What a lovely introduction. And before I begin, I have to give my own thanks. So thank you, Susan Dixon, for inviting me to be on the program. Thank you to Dr. Kenneth Klein, longtime archivist and librarian at USC's East Asia Library, for mentioning my name. And I want to thank everyone here at the Chinese Historical Society of Southern California for putting up with me being 2 time zones away. So thank you for listening. I need to say that I have fond memories of the Chinese Historical Society of Southern California. Periodically, I'd come back to see family here in Los Angeles or out there in Los Angeles. And I remember going to 2 Chinese Historical Society of Southern California meetings. That was in January. So those were at Castelar Elementary School. I remember going to Castelar Elementary School. It was dark, it was January, it was cold. And my sister remembers one of those especially because she had to drive through the Pasadena Freeway in a torrential January rainstorm. And that was quite memorable, driving through all that rainwater. But what I remember is that I would hear these interesting talks and people were committed to Los Angeles, Chinese America, and Los Angeles Chinese American history. So I'm very pleased to be a part of that and to carry it forward yet another January meeting, January 2021. So I think I'll start with a slideshow. So I'm going to go to share screen with my PowerPoint. I do believe it's this one. Okay. And then I'm going to, this is interesting. Sorry, folks. Okay. So, I am going to, wait a minute. Let me figure something out. Sorry about this. This is weird. Okay. Slideshow, but from the beginning. Okay. This is strange. Sorry. Okay, slideshow from the beginning. Okay. You know, if anything can go wrong, it will go wrong. So, I'll tell you what. I'm going to start with this. This is my presentation, Longtime Midwestern. And some of you might be saying, well, that's kind of strange. He doesn't know how to spell Midwestern, but I do know how to spell Midwestern, and I'm doing a deliberate reference to a title you may or may not have seen, especially if you've known Chinese American history. And that would be Longtime Californian. Longtime Californian is the title of the book that was published in the 1970s. And it was written by Victor Nee and Brett DeBerry Nee. My title is inspired by Longtime Californian. This particular study done in the early 1970s, Victor Nee and Brett DeBerry Nee, they were both, I think, anthropology students at Harvard. And so they were going to produce one of the first extended oral history interview collections and one of the first ethnographies done of the Chinese American community in the 1970s. And Longtime Californian is perhaps one of the first Asian American, Chinese American histories that preceded Ron Takaki, Strangers from a Different Shore, Su Cheng Chan's book on Asian America. And it was in that gray area, that period before Asian American history really took off. But I wanted to evoke Longtime Californian because of the following kind of relationship to history. Victor Nee and Brett DeBerry Nee, walking through San Francisco, they tried to contact as many different kinds of Chinese Americans in San Francisco as possible. So they spoke with restaurant workers, and they spoke with Chinatown seamstresses, and they spoke with different people. But when they entered Portsmouth Square in San Francisco, they would often see older Chinese American males. And these older Chinese American males, many of them living in single room occupancies, SROs, those single room hotels, in a place like Chinatown, they could trace their backgrounds back to 1910. They could trace it back to 1890. And so by the 1970s, their lives pretty much coming to an end, but they had so many stories and they had so much history. And this effort, Longtime Californian, was an attempt to listen to those stories, perhaps for the first time. And these older men, been in California since the 19-teens, if not the 1890s, maybe earlier, they would always say the same thing. Longtime Californian, longtime Californian. I mean, they were long in San Francisco or Stockton or Marysville or Fresno or San Diego or Los Angeles or San Bernardino. They were longtime Californians, had a long history. And so I wanted to make a connection in that way, honoring that kind of effort and honoring those kinds of lives, but also realizing that that term, long time, can apply not just to California, but also to longtime New York, East Coast Chinese America, longtime South, meaning in the South, Chinese America, in Mississippi or Arkansas, and longtime in the Midwest. Native son, Chinatown family, LA story. I'm going to subdivide my talk with various kinds of title cards. These are in green, so I've got about 9 of these. And so native son, Chinatown family, LA story. I just wanted to make one more connection with the Chinese Historical Society of Southern California. And it comes through this picture. Now that is Chinatown, and you people, Chinese Historical Society of Southern California, you know this image, it's New Chinatown. And this picture was taken around 1959. And so if you look through the east-west facing, if you look through the west-facing gate right there, that's Hill Street. And if you look at the building at the corner of the west-facing gate, it says restaurant. Well, the restaurant was a restaurant. And that's the reason why my family became Los Angelinos. In the 1950s, 1959, the owners of that restaurant, it was called the Shangri-La restaurant, they hired my father to be a Chinese chef, a Chinese cook. And so that is the reason my sister, myself, my mom, and my dad moved from Stockton, California to LA. And Stockton is kind of like the Midwest in a strange way, but we moved to Los Angeles. And he began working at the Shangri-La restaurant. My mom was a sewing woman. And so she was a sewing woman in Chinatown, LA. My dad working at that restaurant. To make it a little bit more vivid with color, note there are two pictures there, one on the top, one bottom. The one on the top is like Shangri-La Restaurant, 1959. So that pretty much is what I have roughly in my vague memory. But at the bottom is the contemporary property and the contemporary restaurant that is there now. It's the Fu Chow restaurant, which serves Fujian cuisine. And the owner of the Fu Chow restaurant, they can't help but always tell us with the sign written on the side of the building that they filmed Rush Hour, the movie, at that location. And so Chris Tucker and Jackie Chan there at the Fu Chow restaurant in LA, but I'll always remember it as Shangri-La. Now, let's start thinking about Southern California, which you see in front of you, and the Midwest. Now, I'm not the only person in the Midwest who has some kind of Southern California link. There are other people, and one person whose face you should recognize is James Hong. James Hong, he's longtime Southern Californian too, and he's longtime Hollywood. James Hong, distinguished, recognized Chinese American actor since the 1950s, and he had been on television and film, numerous productions, and he is so recognizable. He's an icon. And Eugene Moy just told me that James Hong is a part of the Chinese Historical Society of Southern California community. So I'm hoping he's watching this. But when I want to mention James Hong, yes, longtime Californian, longtime Hollywood, but also longtime Minnesotan. But James Hong did a lot of his growing up in Minnesota. And I read one reference that he was born in Minneapolis. So James Hong, longtime Californian, longtime Minnesotan, tells us that there are some interesting connections that go beyond the surface of what's known, the surface of Hollywood, the surface of LA. So let's dig a little bit deeper. Some of that comes with mapping. So what I want to do real fast right now is mapping today's Chinese America, what you know as the Chinese Historical Society of Southern California, mapping it amidst Asian America, or a PITA. A PITA would be Asian Pacific Islander, Desi America. Asian Pacific Islander, Desi Americans, which is a pan-ethnic umbrella term that can cover Asian America, whether it's Southeast Asian America, or whether it is East Asian America, Pacific Islander, and Desi Americans, meaning Indian Americans, Pakistani Americans, Bangladeshi Americans from South Asia. So let's look at this mapping of Chinese America vis-a-vis Asian America. And I'm going to draw upon the 2010 census. There we go. 2010 census, the last census. You know, it takes 2 years for the US Census Bureau to take the data collected from the census and then work it up. And that's what the census did with the Asian population. Released this May 2nd, 2012. So what do we have? We've got 9 populations here. Now note the following. How many Asian-derived populations are there in the US? There are 24. which is pretty amazing. Many people don't know that. There are 24 different Asian-derived populations. 19 of those 24 are in the Midwest, which is even more surprising because many people think even one Asian population in the Midwest would be surprising. 24 altogether in the US, 19 in the Midwest. What the US Census did was think, what if we took 9 of those 24 and then mapped them? And so they took 9 of these communities. There you see Asian Indian, Cambodian, Chinese, Filipino, Hmong, Japanese, Korean, Pakistani, Vietnamese. Then there's that last one, other Asian. They took 9 of these and said, well, what does it look like? How are they distributed across the US? By the way, every one of those blocks, it equals 50,000 persons. So 50,000 persons. And let's look at this map. The map is 20 cities in the United States. And you see those 20 cities. You could say, I see New York, I see LA, I see San Francisco, I see Seattle. Yes. And so the US Census said, of these 9, which are the top 5 in each of these 20 cities? And so what you see as far as these big towers or columns are the top 5 of the possible 9 in these cities. The blue is Chinese America, but also pay attention to that light brown, which is Asian Indian America. Because as we can see from this map, Asian Indian America is very prominent in a number of cities. Chinese America with that blue tower also prominent. And to be even more clear about it, here is Chinese America as of 2010. You see a lot of blue arrows staring next to or pointed next to these towers of blue, the 50,000. What do those blue arrows mean? It means for this PowerPoint slide, the Chinese population in America, the Chinese are the largest of the 5 of the possible 9. So there's a blue arrow over New York, big tower of Chinese America, blue arrow next to Los Angeles, big tower, blue arrow next to San Francisco. So it gives you a sense of Chinese America located in 20 cities across the United States. How about what we're concerned about tonight, the Midwest? You might see, well, I see a little, not even 50,000 in Minneapolis, it looks like, a little bit more in Chicago, a little bit in Detroit. And so it seems like not as much, certainly not as much as New York or Los Angeles or San Francisco, but the population nevertheless, and also a history. And just because numbers don't seem as large as other communities, doesn't mean those numbers in those communities that are Minneapolis, Chicago, or Detroit are insignificant. Because not unlike what I said a moment ago, long histories, significant histories, they're very hard to see, but nevertheless, we can see them if you pay attention and map them. So here we're going to go to another kind of mapping and another kind of Asian American map. And this was done by students at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 1974. Who were these students? They made the following. What you see there is the front cover of a student newspaper, Rice Paper. And Rice Paper was made by a group at UW-Madison in 1974 called the Rice Paper Collective. Rice Paper Collective, made by Asian American students, 1974, there's a nice image. The second Asian American Midwest Conference, September 1974. There it was at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. But I think there's a nice, interesting, larger significance. And a nice, interesting, larger significance. 1974, that's just 5 years after 1969. And 1969 is the year we usually associate with the beginning of the Asian American student movement and the beginning of Asian American student activism. 1969 was the year of the Third World Strike at San Francisco State. And 1969 we associate with 1968 and the very beginnings of the very term Asian American and Asian Americans. And so student activism at San Francisco State or UCLA or USC or UC Berkeley. All of that part of an Asian American legacy that many people know on the West Coast, but here, 1974, University of Wisconsin-Madison in Madison, students trying to carry on that activism in the Midwest. This is a picture of a map of the traditional Midwest made by the Rice Paper Collective. Note here are the 12 states we usually associate with the Midwest. North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas, Minnesota, Iowa, Missouri, Wisconsin, Illinois, Michigan over Indiana, and Ohio. And there are numbers. Those numbers doing in 1974 what the U.S. Census did in 2012, what I showed you earlier. The Asian American students at the University of Wisconsin-Madison took the U.S. Census data from 1970 and mapped Asian America in these different states of the Midwest. Note the following. When Asian American students made the Rice Paper Collective, they didn't just want to make another Asian American student org. They didn't want to make just another Asian American student newspaper. They deliberately did things like this, mapping the number of Asian Americans and Asian American communities in the Midwest to do the following: to make Rice Paper a central source of information for Asian American communities, students, and individuals in the Midwest, so that they would not be isolated. Because being isolated is a part of that Asian American Midwestern experience. And so Rice Paper sought to provide news about things like the Second Asian American Midwest Conference, or to provide news about what was happening on different campuses in the Big Ten and different colleges throughout the Midwest and in different Asian American communities. Big thing to note is that Rice Paper sought not only to provide a clearinghouse of information, but to make Asian American identities and an Asian American Midwestern identity. Rice Paper didn't last very long. It only lasted for 1 year. But just 1 year makes us treasure what they did a little bit more. And so now I want to put what they did, such as this map, into a broader context. And so that broader context is long particular roots. And when I say long particular roots, I'm going to say that what I'm about to share with you, what I'm about to show, was not known by any of these students in 1974, or by any student on the West Coast at UCLA, USC, UC Berkeley, U Washington. Nobody knew about what I'm about to share with you. Why? Because there were no Asian American Studies courses, no Asian American program, no Asian American history, certainly not at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. That's not going to happen until 1991, when UW-Madison established the first Asian American Studies program in the Midwest and in the Big Ten. But 1974 is a long way from 1991. And so there is no Asian American history. And to be honest with you, I don't think there was much at UCLA in 1974. Still pretty much catch as catch can. But today, more people are curious about an Asian American Midwest and an Asian America that's east of California, in the South, in New York, in the Mid-Atlantic, Northeast, and the Midwest. So that's why we're going to be able to, in 2021, right now, look at long roots. Picture. What is that? That's a picture from the 1910 census. I did not get this from the web. I went to the State Historical Society of Wisconsin, got the big, heavy volumes of the US Census, and scanned the 12 states of the Midwest, 1910. Look at this picture a little bit close up, page 1075. Look at the half of this page that's closest to the left. It's going to tell us about the population of Wisconsin by color, nativity, and parentage. That's race and ethnicity. So let's take a closer look. The three censuses that are gathered together are 1910, 1900, and 1890. How many Chinese in Wisconsin in 1910? 226. 1900, 212. 1890, 119. 34 Japanese in 1910, 5 in 1900, 9 in 1890. All other, they included Koreans, 3 Koreans. Let's go over to percent of total population of Wisconsin. I see a parentheses and a funny footnote 1. The parentheses and funny footnote 1 says Chinese, Japanese, and all other Koreans in parentheses make up less than 1/10 of 1%. So less than 1/10 of 1% compared to, let's take a look at African Americans. African Americans are 0.1% in Wisconsin, 1910, 1900, 1890. Contrasted with the white population, 99.4% in 1910, 99.5% in 1900, and 99.3% in 1890. Now, I know there are some people from Wisconsin who are watching this right now. So I would say for those of you who have spent some time in Wisconsin or living in the Midwest, if you remember walking down the street in Madison, maybe in January, and a strange thought kind of crossed your mind, and this thought came to you, and you're saying, there's just something about this place, Wisconsin. I think those numbers, 99.4, 99.5, and 99.3, might substantiate what may have crossed your mind. Man, it's pretty white out here. And so I think those numbers really do give us a sense of that long history that created that sense of, I really sense something about this place. By the way, the latest census showed Wisconsin's 83.3% white as of the 2010 census, but 83.3, not that far away from 99.4. I think this history substantiates or gives us the reason for those figures, 99.4. I would say that most people who, if they know about Wisconsin's immigration history, would say that this was the normal, if not the only, immigration history of Wisconsin. German, Polish, Swiss, Danish, Norwegian, Swedish, Italian, Irish. It is the transatlantic, British Isles, European immigration. And I would say that many people who know about Wisconsin immigration history, because they do their genealogies and they're trying to trace their family histories, they would perhaps infer and assume that this is not only the normal immigration history and only immigration history, it might be the real immigration history. And real means coming from across the Atlantic, being from the British Isles or European. Another aspect of real is look how far back this goes. I know some of you are looking at this right now. You're coming right up to your screen, looking at 1890, 1914, between 1845 and 1890, or 1870. That's mid-19th century. And so I wouldn't be surprised if some people say the real history is 1870, mid-19th century. What about Asian Americans? I would say those same people, and I would say even Asian Americans in the Midwest would say, well, dang, we just don't go back that far, or Asian people don't go back that far. 1870 is what makes it real. Come on, Asian Americans, didn't they show up like in 1980? Or maybe I heard this year, 1965? Really? 1870 is the real year. Well, surprise, surprise. So this is Chinese America in Wisconsin. The earliest sightings of Chinese persons occurred in 1870. And one example, just one example in Wisconsin, but there were other examples across the Midwest. One example saw a Chinese man arrive in Watertown, Wisconsin in the early 1870s. The Milwaukee newspaper, the Milwaukee Sentinel, reported about this one Chinese guy walking around Watertown, Wisconsin. He was a hand laundry person, and it reported, quote, "He caused a sensation just walking down the street," close quote. What did he do? Set himself on fire? No, but just being Chinese caused a sensation. Note this. He was not the in Chicago in the 1870s. Chinese spotted in Minnesota in 1868. 1870, about the same time as the sweet spot of European and British Isles immigration being early, supposedly being real in the mid-19th century. No, this is 150 a lot simpler, 2020. Subtract 1870 from 2020. Like to remember you know centennials, that's 100 years. You know bicentennials. Celebration. They spent years in Wisconsin. By the way, that's when they date the sesquicentennial, when a Midwestern state union. Hey, Chinese Americans can celebrate its sesquicentennial in the Midwest. And by extension, America can celebrate its sesquicentennial in the Midwest. It built and continued to grow 1880, 1890, 1900. I hope you enjoyed that image, the big images of Wisconsin in the background, those smaller images. But what I want you to know is that where you see the irregular shapes in the map of Wisconsin, those are counties of Wisconsin. And it means there is a growing, enumerated counting of a Chinese person or persons in those darkened areas of the state. This is not to say there are 1,000 Chinese showing up in those darkened areas. Usually it's like 1 or 2, but still 1880, 1890, 1900, a growing presence. 1870s, why is it that Chinese are moving to the Midwest? The usual starting point to tell the story of Chinese coming to the US is 1840s, Chinese leaving Guangdong, leaving a specific area of 5 districts in southeastern China, coming to Hawaii and Gold Mountain from some. So yes, the Midwestern story shares that origin story of, in the 19th century, 1840s, from Guangdong to California. But no, there was a second movement. And that second movement had everything to do with this. It's a map of California, right? Every black dot that you see on that map of California is an instance of anti-Chinese violence. And so from 1850 to about 1901, every black dot represents a moment of anti-Chinese violence. A lot of that happening in the central part of California, as you can see. But there were some incidents in Southern California. Pasadena had a large anti-Chinese driving out in the 1880s. And of course, in Los Angeles, 24 October 1871, there was a large anti-Chinese massacre that took the lives of 18 to 20 Chinese men, Chinese males, one boy. And also, those are just the males. There were Chinese women who were also victimized 24 October 1871. This is the picture of Calle de los Negros. This is where the massacre happened. You know the massacre because every year there's a memorial in Los Angeles. I wish I could be there, but 24 October 1871, one of many anti-Chinese moments. What's important to note is that the newspapers such as the New York Times and Chicago Tribune reported that Chinese community leaders in San Francisco and in California were advising Chinese, leave California, leave Gumsan, it's just too dangerous. And so the advice was go east. So go east to the Rocky Mountains, go east to places called Chicago, go east to Detroit, go east to a place called Minnesota, and many historians believe the anti-Chinese violence played its role in motivating Chinese to come to the Midwest. Unfortunately, violence followed, and so in 1899 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, the only instance of a large citywide anti-Chinese violent act lasting 4 days happened in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Throughout the city of Milwaukee, gangs and roving mobs went trying to find Chinese hand laundries, trying to set them on fire or smashing windows. So, long history of violence, illegal or extra-legal violence. Here, let me show also that there's a Midwestern story to a familiar chapter that you know, Chinese Exclusion, 1882 to 1943. Chinese exclusion. This is the picture that many people associate with Chinese exclusion. The first time the US Congress discriminated in immigration policy, discriminating on the basis of race, ethnicity, and national origin. A system of laws that lasted for 61 years. Most people think Chinese exclusion, oh, I know that, that's Angel Island. And that's where those interrogations lasted. And that's where you see women detained and people detained. This is a picture from Angel Island, women detained. But let me say that Chinese exclusion also happened in the Midwest. Let me buzz through some of these photos. Now, I think I'm going to be leaving the PowerPoint presentation with the Chinese Historical Society of Southern California. You can look through a number of these and look at the interesting stories and details here. Let's take, as an example, the first on this page, Jessie Choi Henhua. Followed her immigrant mother's career path as an actress, applied for pre-investigation status to travel with an acting group in Europe and South Africa. And this is 1937. A number of stories here, but note the Midwestern details, Chicago. The third of these, Ji Shi, married one of the first Chinese merchants in Chicago and wanted to support the application of her son to both visit China and come back to the US, 1940. Pictures of women, pictures of lives caught in the Chinese exclusion system, pictures of lives in the Midwest. Here is St. Paul in Minnesota. Also, Chinese exclusion collected data. And so they collected data of names, addresses, ages, height, and specific places of residence or business. Look at the fourth name there, Yuet Town. Yuet Town was a laundry person, age 34. He was 5 feet, 5.5 inches tall, had a white witness on his behalf, F. Murphy. March 15, 1894 was when he first came to Wisconsin. He was at 110 North Pinckney Street. And for those of you who know Madison, that's right off the Capitol Square. Also, list of Chinese in Flint, Michigan, list of Chinese in Pontiac, Michigan, list of Chinese in Ann Arbor, Michigan, 1904. Not only pictures, not only lists, not only names, but also specific files. And here we get to a specific file. This is a person, Lung Shi in Chicago. I'm guessing Lung Shi was in her 30s. You're looking at this right now, you're probably guessing those ages. Lung Shi in Chicago. She had 5 kids, and she had a husband whose last name was Chin. Lung Shi is going to be processed by the Chinese exclusion system. But also, here, an example, something you recognize from the West Coast, Angel Island, and an interrogation of her husband, just like Angel Island. But Lung Shi is also going to have her children processed by exclusion. Here is Yut Yun. Yut Yun is 5 years old. This document is 1927. Yut Yun is 5 years old in 1927. She's second to the youngest of the five. But she has a younger sister, Yut Gai. And Yut Gai was born just 4 months before the processing here in 1927. 4 months earlier, I think because Yut Gai was born in Chicago, her parents thought, well, might be good to give her an English language name. So here is Yut Yun, 5 years old, and here is Yut Gai, or by her English language name, Esther. So Esther Chin. But these are not just pictures of cute kids. This is during Chinese exclusion. So this is Yut Yun, and this is her Chinese exclusion paper. And this is her Chinese exclusion. By the way, real, this is a Google mapping of something you may have seen close up. That says 2236 Wentworth Avenue. This is 2236 Wentworth Avenue today in Chicago's Chinatown. It's the third building from the left, and that building looks old enough to be where, I would not be surprised, the small Chinatown family lived their lives. Survival and persistence. You know, I am running up against a time survival thing. I see that I am having only a few minutes left. So I am going to quickly go through survival and persistence over 151 years. They had to persist through things like this. Apparently having a Chinese hand laundry was a fad. So people took pictures outside of Chinese hand laundry. Sometimes it wasn't just a funny fad. Madison, Wisconsin in 1910, there was a boycott of Chinese hand laundries. Let white people patronize white people, said the sign. But also there were some Chinese who really worked hard to survive through this. This is the Choi family of Milwaukee. The Choi family, to be more specific, Charlie Choi had a dream. He wanted to build a restaurant, but not just a restaurant. He wanted a restaurant and then a 406-seated theater, a band stage, a ballroom on the second floor, a billiards hall on the third floor. And so that was his dream, a pleasure palace in Milwaukee. He got it built. This is a postcard of the Choi restaurant. This got demolished to make room for a parking lot. The family continued, flourished, and developed and left long roots of their own. Here is an example of one of those Chinese families in the Midwest who left a legacy, Paul Wong and Edward Chin in the 1950s. I wanted to show this because it is so Wisconsin appropriate. As I'm about to go out into 23-degree weather and 15-degree weather this Sunday, this is Wisconsin and the Midwest. But you know, the story doesn't end with just people who are otherwise only known to their families. There are Midwestern Chinese American and Asian American legacies. Wang Chin-fu is one of the three that I'm about to show you. Wang Chin-fu was a Chinese American in the Midwest, but more, he was an activist in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s. He actively spoke out against Chinese exclusion. And he started things like this, the Chinese American, a newspaper, volume 1, number 1, published by Wang Chin-fu at 283 South Clark Street in Chicago. And the next time I go to Chicago, I'm going to 283 South Clark Street and do an homage to the Chinese American. Today, Wang Chin-fu is a symbol of activism for young people. That's why we see Citizen Wang. I love that. Wang Chin-fu, you should note this, in 1870, he became a US citizen, one of the few Chinese Americans that get naturalized. Where did it happen? Grand Rapids, Michigan. So Guang Chin-Fu, Grand Rapids, Michigan, Chicago, and he also gave a talk at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Grace Lee Boggs. Grace Lee Boggs, activist in Detroit, along with her husband, Jimmy Boggs. They organized labor, they organized civil rights work, they organized African-American laborers in Detroit. Grace Lee Boggs, to the end of her days, a Detroit activist. And today she has her t-shirt. We are the solutionaries we've been looking for. Amen, Grace. And Vincent Chin. Vincent Chin did not expect to be a martyr. He did not expect to be the spark plug for an Asian American social movement. But in 1982, because he was killed in 1982, killed by two white Detroiters on a night when he was celebrating, Vincent Chin was celebrating his bachelor's party. Vincent Chin became the unwitting symbol of a large, renewed Asian American movement. Rally for May 9th. This is the Vincent Chin Justice Movement in Detroit, but it wasn't just Detroit. It was nationwide. Here's the Southern California Justice for Vincent Chin Committee, moving out of Detroit, moving out of Michigan, and being here in Southern California in 1983. That's LA. I think that's First Street. I think that's First Street going up to Broadway. That bus, that's an RTD. That's a Rapid Transit District bus, 1983. And here you see Asian Americans in Los Angeles participating in the Justice for Vincent Chin movement. By the way, why was there the need for a Justice for Vincent Chin movement? Because the judicial process in 1983 in Detroit pretty much let the two guys who killed Vincent Chin, even though they were caught bloody-handed, pretty much left them off at $3,000 fine, 3 years probation. So that mobilized a Justice for Vincent Chin movement. You know, I tried to give you some pictures of a Midwestern history. You may have connected. Some of you may have been there in 1983, or you know Vincent Chin. You've heard the name. I've showed you glimpses of a Midwestern Asian American past that I think you will now want to know more. And I think you will want to know more because taken together, this is a long history. And it's a long history that can be a long time North Dakotan, a long time South Dakotan, a long time Nebraskan, a long time Kansanan, a long time Minnesotan, a long time Iowan, a long time Missourian, a long time Illinoisian, a long time Michiganian, a long time Indianian, a long time Ohioan, a long time Wisconsin. I hope you become much more curious and interested and involved and include a Midwestern Asian America when you think of the Chinese Historical Society of Southern California, because it's been a long time. So thank you very much. Hello, hello, Lorene.
Hi. So it looks like Eugene Moy, who was supposed to lead our Q&A, he might have gotten disconnected.
Ah!
So had a lot of technical difficulties today.
Yeah, well, you saw the first technical difficulty at the beginning today.
Yeah.
Sorry, folks. Sorry.
We tried to keep up with you. So it was, and you know, it was a great presentation. So I'll kind of take a lead here in terms of asking some of the questions. And for those of you, I'm the member at large on the board of the Chinese Historical Society of Southern California, and I do the behind the scenes work here. So
she does a great job.
Feel free to type in any questions in the Q&A. We disabled the chat, so and we will go through them. So let's start off with Sue Ellen asked, she said, thank you very much for the wonderful presentation. Have you come across any information on the CACA Chicago Lodge?
Interesting, and that is something I really want to look up. Sue Ellen and everybody out there, if you do have connections with Chinese American organizations, benevolent associations, Chinese organizations in Chicago or Detroit or Cleveland or Minneapolis, let's work together, because that is definitely a source of information that I want to respect. And I want to begin from a place where people know people. The last thing I want to do is just show up and say, hey, I really want to look at your records. Are you kidding? People and organizations and the family associations, they had to go through the Chinese exclusion system. Do you really think people want to show records after having to go through 61 years? And then there's the confession program of having to pretty much be under surveillance for such a long time. So I really want to be from a place of respect. And if you have personal contacts with organizations, let's work together. Because right now I'm just working off of the Chicago Tribune and newspapers, the US Census, and what I can from the National Archives. That's one kind of view, but I really want to hear from Chinese American voices, Asian American voices in places like Chicago, Detroit, etc. So Sue Ellen, thank you for your question. Yes, I'm on the hunt. When I'm not going to be at 2236 Wentworth or 283 South Clark, I am going to definitely try to respectfully come and visit Chinese organizations. So, Sue Ellen, it is a to be continued answer.
Okay, great. And so we have more of a comment here from Michael Way. He said, thank you for sharing, greatly enjoyed. And they're invited by their 82-year-old mother, native Chicago Chinatown daughter, and their family ran a restaurant back in the 20s to 50s. And they led a Chinese restaurant in area in the 1939 World's Fair. So you're making a lot of connections with folks across the Midwest. Harry Wong asked if the Vincent Chin case, I believe, reviewed because of, was it reviewed because of backlash?
The problem was locally, the case would go before a local Detroit judge. And that was a judge on, I believe, the Detroit Superior Court, who basically cut a plea deal with the two white Detroiters. And the plea deal was $3,000 fine, 3 years probation. You know, there is so much more to restudy and revisit as far as the Vincent Chin case. And in some ways, we have another anniversary coming up. 1982 is when he had his head bashed in. 2022, another anniversary. So it could be, it's time to revisit and ask really precise questions. Both Ronald Ebens and Michael Nitz were two white Detroiters who killed or did the things that eventually led to Vincent Chin's death. You know, they were caught red-handed. They were outside a McDonald's restaurant. Michael Nitz held Vincent Chin and held him in place. Ronald Ebens took his baseball bat, a Louisville Slugger, just bashed in his head. And they were stopped by a Detroit police officer. So the Detroit police officer off duty, who was in the McDonald's, had to draw his weapon to stop the beating. They were caught red-handed. Why did the judge agree to a plea bargain? Because that was a 15-year manslaughter. The judge had a 15-year manslaughter in hand. The two guys were caught red-handed. Other Detroit judicial figures said, you know, it should have been second-degree murder. Things to ask. It was a plea bargain, and the judge in the case said, you know, what I decided, I'm going to say I'm doing it out of mercy because I know men like this, and men like this don't deserve time in prison, and I'm going to exercise my mercy, and $3,000 fine, 3 years probation. The only way justice for Vincent Chen proceeded judicially after that decision was because they could not pursue it in state court or in the Detroit courts, because that's double jeopardy. But in federal courts, they tried to pursue a civil rights violation. And so that is what happened from 1983 to about 1987, to try to get some kind of accountability through a civil rights violation conviction. But I guess to answer your short question, it's so weird. Why 3 years probation, $3,000 fine? Why isn't that reviewed? In many ways, judicially and institutionally, could not happen because double jeopardy. And it seemed like the only recourse was the federal courts with a federal civil rights violation. So I hope that kind of gets at what you're asking.
Right. I know the Vincent Chen case is really complex and a big part of Asian American history. Marjorie Lee asked, do you think that the Chinese chose to migrate to the Midwest because of the hostilities the Chinese faced in the West, or were adventurous to pursue a new territory with less competition?
A little bit of both in some ways, although, you know, the explanation for the 1870s violence and the continuation of the violence and the appearance of Chinese in Chicago, Detroit, Minnesota, and Milwaukee kind of fits together nicely. It's very proximate. And so I would say causally, as being proximate, it corresponds really well. Now, there are other Chinese moving into the Midwestern area, I think from the South, I think from the East Coast. And so it is a multi-dimensional, multi-configurational problem that has not been looked at enough. I tended to focus on the violence because, again, it seems like it is so correlated so strongly. I also looked at the violence because I know the Chinese Historical Society of Southern California, you do honor the memory of the 1871 massacre every year, along with the Chinese American Museum. But Margie, yes, something again to look at. Again, you know, once I get off my homage at 283 South Clark and the Wentworth Avenue address, if I am able to work with people who know people at family associations and benevolent associations in the Midwest, I'd like to know, what is the narrative? What are the narratives of how did Chinese come to Chicago or Detroit or Milwaukee? Do we have the exact narrative? I don't know. I have my doubts, but the very fact that a narrative is kept alive, the very fact that a narrative gets talked about or shared, that tells me that Asian Americans and Chinese Americans are trying to keep a flame alive. They're trying to keep a legacy alive. And that is in and of itself a valuable history, both to reclaim as community activism and as historiography. So I think I'll approach it that way. And by the way, you know, in the Midwest, I don't know if this is true in LA, but sometimes you get students when they take Asian Am history classes, they want to know, well, who was the first Chinese person in Madison, Wisconsin? Or who was the first Chinese person in East Lansing, Michigan? So I don't know if you get that in classes out in Southern California. Well, who was the first Chinese person who showed up at the Calle de los Negros? So, but my way, this is my way of saying, who was the first? That's part of a more interesting, larger recovery project. And I think it would be so cool to continue with that kind of recovery project. So thanks, Margie.
Great. And so our next question is, other than Chicago, were there any other Chinatowns in the Midwest?
Here's something interesting. None in Milwaukee. Milwaukee did not have a Chinatown. Now, question, did the 1889 4 days of anti-Chinese rioting have something to do with that? There were 60 Chinese in Milwaukee. Many of them were hand laundry persons. Interesting question. Did that keep Chinese from developing a Chinatown, a central location? We do know, as I showed you, Charlie Toy building his big 4-story Chinese restaurant. Maybe that comes close to being a Chinatown. Madison, Wisconsin. If you should ever come to Madison, there's a street called South Park Street. I looked on the web and somebody once asked on the web, is there a Chinatown in Madison? And someone wrote back, I think it's South Park Street, because there's like 3 Chinese restaurants on South Park Street. There used to be a Chinese hand laundry place on South Park Street. Chinatown. Wait a minute. Oh, good question. Detroit. Detroit had a Chinatown. It was a Chinatown since 1870. Here, let me make this paradoxical. Detroit had 2 Chinatowns because the first one got demolished to make way for a freeway. The first Chinatown got bulldozed away in 1959 or so, 1960, 61, to make way for the Lodge Expressway. That's a freeway. So they had to build a new one at, I believe is it Peterloo or Peterborough? At the Peterborough neighborhood. And that's where I met Grace Lee Boggs. So there's a second in another neighborhood. St. Louis had a Chinatown, or St. Louis has 2 Chinatowns. The first got demolished, had bulldozed away, because, as I read it, the St. Louis Cardinals needed a new baseball stadium. St. Louis Cardinals, the pride of St. Louis, needed a new place to play baseball. They tore down the Chinese American neighborhood to build Busch Stadium. So where is the Chinatown now in St. Louis? You can Google St. Louis and Chinatown. It's just a street with no like Chinatown art or Chinatown gateway like you have in Chinatown now on Broadway, or New Chinatown with gateways. It's just a street. It's just a street with, looks like little sidewalk accessibility and maybe a Chinese restaurant on either side that you have to swing into. And so to answer your question, St. Louis, yes, but got demolished and now doesn't seem to have much. Detroit got demolished, now doesn't seem to have much. Chicago had to move. 1927, Chicago's early Chinese American community developed near the Loop, but it had to move to 22nd Street, like where it is today. So, not unlike Los Angeles demolishing its Chinatown to make way for Union Station, not unlike San Francisco's Chinatown that almost got demolished because there was a bubonic plague epidemic, supposedly, and they had to demolish the Chinatown. I think that's what the Midwest shares with Los Angeles and San Francisco. Yeah, demolishment. Either threatened demolishment or actual demolishment. So there is another Southern California, Chinese Historical Society, Southern California, and Midwestern link there. I was going to wear my Dodger hat, by the way. Yeah, I should have. When I said St. Louis, I should have worn my Dodger hat. Sorry.
Your different roots in different areas in the United States. So there's a couple questions actually specifically about the Chinese American community. So the first one asks about if there's any record of how many Chinese were engineers in Milwaukee and possibly just in kind of in the Midwest.
Interesting. You know, I would link engineering with, what historians call the second generation. The second generation meaning American-born, therefore citizens according to the 14th Amendment, and American-born, not unlike in Los Angeles. Many second generation Chinese American Los Angelinos, not just living in Chinatown, but living in mixed neighborhoods. Like my neighborhood, I grew up near Temple and Beaudry. And so Temple, Beaudry, and Belmont High School. That's considered a mixed neighborhood. Japanese Americans, Latinx, Chicanx, Native Americans in the 1960s, when American Indians developed a growing community in Los Angeles, and Chinese Americans. So second generation, when there is more access to the kind of education where you can be credentialed, right? And you can be credentialed as an engineer. The bitter irony for the second generation in the 1930s is that they thought they were going to be now professionals and white-collar professionals, but many could not get jobs. Many could not get jobs that was commensurate with their education and their credentials because of discrimination. So they had to return to Chinatown to work in the hand laundry, or to work in the restaurant, or to be a waiter in a restaurant. So that was the bitter tragedy, the bitterness of the second generation in the 1930s. After World War II, and then after the Immigration Act of 1965, that kicked in 1968, you do have a growing credentialed population, not only of Chinese, but Asian Americans. And I think if I were to look for, God, if I was to plot this on a graph, the spike here of engineers and getting jobs as engineers are growing, steadily growing from through World War II, after World War II, spiking 1965, 1968. Though, even though you become an engineer, that doesn't mean, and this does happen in the 1970s, and this is a history that has to be researched. Many engineers working for TRW or Hughes Aircraft in Southern California. With the downturn in the aerospace industry in Southern California, a lot of engineers who came from Hong Kong or got their degrees at UCLA or SC, they got laid off. Downturn at Hughes or TW in 1974, energy crisis in 1974. A lot of people got laid off. So yeah, you're credentialed, but you're still up against it in many ways. Here, I don't think I'm telling a story out of school if I mention Lucy Liu. Lucy Liu, actress, famous, mega superstar. Lucy Liu grew up on the East Coast, I think New Jersey. Both of her parents were scientists. And so both of her parents, Asian American, Chinese American, I think Taiwanese American, both of them were scientists, mom and dad. Dad ran into career issues. He had to raise the family because it was a family. Mom, I think, still was able to pursue her job as a scientist. Dad supported the family by selling pens. And so what, fountain pens, ballpoint pens? And I'm not putting down selling pens, but I don't think he went to graduate school to sell pens. My point is kind of a long roundabout answer, thinking engineers, yeah, let's think about the full gamut of what that could mean. Engineers at different phases and points in the Chinese American story, engineers in the Midwestern story, the full gamut of, yes, you're credentialed, but there are also ways in which it's also vulnerable. So I think that's kind of a long answer. Hey, let me give you a nice little detail. East Lansing, Michigan. There's a stone bridge in East Lansing, Michigan. People cross that bridge every day. They don't know that it was a Chinese American female architect who designed that bridge. She came to the University of Michigan. She studied architecture at the University of Michigan under a special scholarship program that brought women students in from various places throughout Asia. She got her architecture degree, designed that bridge in East Lansing, Michigan, built there in the 1950s. How many people know that? Really? How many people know that? And yet it is a living thing that is right there. So I don't know if I answered your question, but I'm going to be on the lookout. Credentialed professionalism as another part of this Midwestern story. Thank you.
Great. And so I think we only have time for one more question, and I apologize to those who we didn't get to your questions. We did have one a little bit about the post-65 context, which I think, Victor, you were starting to talk about, kind of answering how the Chinese American community might have changed. But we do have, I think, maybe ending on this last question about kind of bringing it back to your presentation and commenting a little bit more about the connections between Chinese Americans across different regions and how that may have shaped the experiences of the longtime Midwestern Chinese.
Interesting point. If you're making a reference to Rice paper and the University of Wisconsin students who tried to make connections across the Midwest, oh God, how much impact did they have? They had impact amongst themselves, right? I'm hoping they had impact to students who are going to small colleges like Worcester College in Ohio, or University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, or The Ohio State University. I'm hoping that for that year in 1974, they had students who realized that there were connections to be made. And what's interesting is that students were hungry, not just at Wisconsin, but at other Midwestern places, to know that there were fellow Midwestern Asian Americans. Oh God, you know, if you go Googling today, Asian Americans in the Midwest want to reach out. Asian Americans want to know, what is it like to be Asian Americans in the Chicagoland area? What is it like to be Asian American in the state of Illinois? They reach out. There are ways in order to make connections and to create inventories of knowledge. Asian Americans Advancing Justice, very active in Chicago. They produced reports about being Asian American in the Midwest. That has been a resource for different Asian Americans throughout this region. Other possibilities, you know, I wouldn't be surprised if that big data set that got produced 4 years ago, the National Asian American Survey, NAS, I wouldn't be surprised if you could disaggregate by region and by locale. And, you know, Asian Americans participate in these big surveys. To take another Asian American community, the Hmong American community, especially in Minnesota. Hmong Americans since 1975, and very much so in the 1970s and 1980s, they really know that knowledge, research, inventories of knowledge are so important to dispel stereotypes about Hmong. And so they have had such an impressive record in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan, developing social service surveys, participating in social science surveys, doing research, writing dissertations about Hmong. So I don't know if I'm answering your question, but my point is a sense of crossing borders here and trying to claim that common. It could be that being in the Midwest makes you want to do it more because it is so isolating. It is so isolated. And there was actually a Chicano scholar who said Chicano and Latinx pan-ethnicity, meaning getting together as Mexican Americans, Chicanx, Puerto Ricans, getting together happens easier in the Midwest because the need is so great and people are more willing to do it. That is an interesting thought. Maybe in the Midwest, Asian Americans are more willing, and Chinese Americans are more willing to cross borders and to make more of that common. So thank you. It seems like a really good question. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Victor. I think that's a great way to kind of end your presentation, to think about how we can build community and make connections and the possibilities of that. So thank you again so much for such a wonderful presentation. Before we end though, I do want to hand it off again to our president, Susan Dixon, who just has some kind of final goodbyes for everyone. And thank you again, Victor.
Oh, hi, I'm glad you stayed with us so that we could thank our community partner, the China Society, and we hope that you will join them on January 11th. They have Devin Fitzgerald. He had talked to the Historical Society, but before a few years ago, found him very interesting, Chinese and Western books of the Ming Dynasty. And you could, we have a link on our website, or you could go to China Society of SoCal.org. The next one is actually the following day, which is Stories of a Leaf. The Chinese American Museum has a tea talk where you could find out everything you wanted to know on the world of tea and Korean tea culture. And then last, go to the last one. So we have not locked in our February one, but the first Wednesday of February, we will be back with you. But before I let you go, I want to do a membership push. January, we're starting our 2021. So there are several, on the other slide, there are several reasons that we would want you to be, we would want you to be a member. Okay, so your free monthly programs. So this is continuing our tradition. It's even available to more. Tonight we had 100 people. You know, that would be very unusual at our former. Each month, 11 months out of the year, we have our newsletter. Yearly, we have a publication called the Gumsan Journal. This year, your membership, you'll be able to get 2. We have a special one in the summer. You could go to our website. We have a lot of history content, find out more about it, and we are upgrading it as we speak. We have a huge history archive that we have been collecting for more than 40 years that we keep. We have the Chinatown Heritage Visitor Center, which right now is closed, but and we're not doing our walking tour program, but we did receive a grant to improve, make digital our walking tours. So you would be helping us to support that. So please visit us at chssc.org, and good night. Thank you again.